Welcome to Schools Out with Sam Sorbo, a series about education, what you don't know, what you should know, and what to do about it. Last week, we focused on insecurities we have, even just considering the daunting task of educating our children. This week, we need to define our terms, and it might surprise you to learn that the very definition of education has shifted over time. Have you ever asked yourself what education, the word, really means? We all want our kids to get a good education, but what exactly do we have in mind? Typically, that our kids attend a good college and get a good job, right? But is that right? Education. The online Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it as the action or process of educating or of being educated, the knowledge and development resulting from the process of being educated, and the field of study that deals mainly with methods of teaching and learning in schools. It's funny. In school, we were never allowed to use a derivative word in its definition. My, how times have changed. So to be thorough, I looked up the word to educate, which is to provide with information, to inform, to provide schooling for, to train by formal instruction and supervised practice, especially in a skill, trade, or profession, to develop mentally, morally, or aesthetically, especially by instruction. Finally, to persuade or condition to feel, believe, or act in a desired way. But then I got really curious because that seemed such a broad, sweeping, generalized definition. And I wrote a book, Words for Warriors, about the degradation of our English language and how the culture busies itself changing the meanings of words. I looked it up in my 1828 version of the Noah Webster American Dictionary of the English Language. There, it is stated that to educate comes from the Latin for to lead and means to bring up, as in a child, to instruct, to inform, and enlighten the understanding, to instill into the mind principles of arts, science, morals, religion, and behavior. The noun education is defined similarly and includes correcting the temper and forming the manners and habits of youth, fitting them for usefulness in their future stations. It seems that education used to be about forming the whole person rather than cramming for a test or studying human sexuality. Albert Einstein said, "Education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think." Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Intelligence plus character, that is the true goal of education." If education is simply about stuffing information, details about history and math facts, grammar rules, into a child's brain, well, all I can say is those kids will be bored. Education should focus on personal development, growing children into adults, and not just any kind of adult. We want our children to be successful human beings. And that includes business, but I fear that our current system has convinced us to focus entirely on the fiscal results, financial rewards, at the cost of the whole person. When I was a young woman, I had the opportunity to travel with a tour group to the communist Soviet Union for a week. It was springtime, still with the winter chill, but the thaw had begun, and although everything was wet from melting snow, there was a nice feeling of fresh and new in the air. As you can imagine, there were strict rules for entry behind the Iron Curtain. We were warned by our tour guides that groups like ours were spied upon, our rooms were likely bugged, and our money was reported, traced, and accounted for. We did get to go shopping, of course, at the large state-run department store in the middle of Moscow, GUM. I wanted to buy a traditional Russian floral scarf as a souvenir. The procedure was complicated. First, I approached the counter to look at the scarves. There was a long waiting line before I got up to the display area where a surly older woman who clearly did not appreciate all the tourists interrupting her nap begrudgingly showed me the 5 scarf choices. I picked the royal blue one, and she gave me a receipt for scarf number 4. Then I took my place last in the pay line, and after about a half-hour wait, a bored young man at a cash register accepted my money and furnished me with another receipt, which he admonished me to keep handy for the authorities upon my departure from the country. And that would also be my coupon to retrieve my package. So I went to, yes, a 3rd long line for picking up the scarf. What might have been equivalent to a 15-minute pleasure at Macy's, where good customer service is rewarded and poor service is reported, instead turned into a 2-hour ordeal at the state-run department store, with service personnel employed by the uncaring state and untrained in any kind of customer service because there's no competition. I felt powerless and frustrated, no doubt similar to all the other shoppers and workers in the establishment. Well, welcome to the communist government-guided economy. I tell you this because I want to underline that if you grew up in this same system, you might think it were completely normal to stand in 3 different lines to choose from a very limited supply of items. You might shrug your shoulders at the wasted time and energy and think, well, it's not perfect, but it's the system we have, because you wouldn't know any better. In fact, there's an old joke from the Soviet Union. The government pretends to pay us, and we pretend to work. Hey, let's stop pretending that whatever is wrong with our education system is just the best we can do. Wrong. We can and should do better. Parents should reject the current paradigm for their children. If you feel inadequate to the task of educating your own grade school aged children, perhaps you were never taught grade school level subject matter. Because if you were, then where is the disconnect? Did you just learn for test taking and then forget it all? Or do you still know your basic math, addition, subtraction, your times tables, but just lack the confidence you think you need to teach it? Are you at a complete loss when it comes to history because, like me, you basically slept through social studies and didn't learn much in that course? Or do you have a love of history but think the teachers know better how to teach it? What is the key to teaching history or English grammar or anything? What is the mystery to teaching? Here are a few things to keep in mind. Schools make you feel incapable. Government schools are failing, and you can do better than that. You have already proven with your toddler that you are capable. Schools teach to the test, but education should seek mastery, not mimicry. And your child is special. Stop towing the status quo line for him. We need to dispel some myths concerning your own education. This is the hardest part, believe it or not. Why? Because the first steps to solving a problem is to admit you have one. And that's like waking up from a bad dream. Perhaps this is what it was like for all the folks who had grown up under the communist dictatorship in East Germany, waking up the day after the Berlin Wall came down, once the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics released its iron grip on their occupied territories. You see, these unfortunate East Germans had been lied to for decades, convinced that the wall was intended to keep out the people from the West who wanted to come into the workers' paradise. Suddenly, the barrier disappeared, and these folks wandered, confused, like bears after a prolonged hibernation, into the springtime, novelty, and obscene plenty of wealthy, capitalist West Berlin. They saw shelves in stores chock full of myriad choices, the tremendous production of goods of the capitalist system. They saw so much food and so many options, it overwhelmed them. They walked into the Mercedes-Benz dealerships and signed up to receive new, masterfully engineered cars, not like those crappy Trabants that communism barely produced. They were shocked to learn they actually needed cash. If you have the currency, you can make the trade in a free economy. It's that simple. But these people abruptly woke to the fact that they had been lied to, most of them, for their whole lives. And the older folks among them, although they may have recognized the lies in the beginning, they were so far gone into that nightmare they could not awaken, still believing in the authority of the state. The truth is that there is an education smorgasbord out there, but we are inside the government commissary. Quite simply, we've been lied to. We've been assured we've reached competency when we knew deep in our hearts we hadn't. We've been told we are incapable when we knew we are better than our grades. We've been lied to by an authority figure, and we don't know what to do about that. So we covered it up and pretended that everything was just fine. So let's take a moment to unwrap this, because every homeschool journey begins with feelings of incompetence. What did you really learn in school all those days and months and years? Well, you learned that you were not capable of anything you hadn't been formally instructed in, because the main message of the schools is that you need the teacher to spoon feed you information so you can regurgitate it on the test. Have you noticed testing has only grown in importance since you and I attended school? That's a major problem in our schools. Teaching to the test. In other words, teaching a subject just enough for the student to be able to give the details to pass the exam, but the student is never asked to display true proficiency. Now, I personally was a horrible test taker. I could tutor my classmate in the material, and he'd get an A, while I would score a C for the same material. I developed proficiency explaining the subject to my study partner, but I personally was too anxious to perform well on the exam. Students have developed an instinct to ask what amounts to the most important question. Will this be on the test? And then the student studies just the particulars for the exam, only to forget much of them the following day. Does he ever really reach the point of mastery? Well, sadly, the answer must be no, because that's not actually learning, it's memorization. The mark of a truly successful education is the ability of the student to become the teacher. The student exhibits mastery when he can instruct someone else in the discipline, and, in fact, that's exactly what it takes for an individual to really learn the subject that well. A PhD candidate must defend his thesis in a discussion setting when he is asked specifically probing questions to facilitate his display of proficiency and mastery. In this sense, he is teaching it, not just passing a test. So, what were you? Educated? Or were you simply schooled? If you feel like you just don't have the ability or even know where to begin, that's because of your schooling, which didn't leave you with a sense of mastery and thus didn't amount to an education. You might think, well, it got me this far, so it couldn't have been all that bad. Okay, you'd be right. But is that what you're striving for your children? Not all that bad? Because the attitude of just good enough didn't build this country. The horse and carriage wasn't good enough for Edsel or Ford, and driving wasn't good enough for the Wright brothers. We are a land of innovators and creators, improvers of every paradigm who are in turn wealth creators by default. The economy is driven by these inventors, big and small. It isn't a fluke that so many of our greatest visionaries never graduated college. Our system puts learning inside a box, and college hammers the nails on the lid. The bureaucracy runs the game, and it's confined inside four walls. Education should be liberated like the human spirit. The funny thing is, we know this is true, viscerally, but in practice, it becomes so hard for us to implement for our own lives and the lives of our children. How can we make organic education work for our children when we don't even know what that is, what it looks like, how it's implemented? I propose returning to the basics, the definition of the word. Education used to be training children morally, showing them how to discern truth, beauty, and goodness, because that was a reflection of the search for meaning in the universe. It imbued the pupil with a sense of purpose, an awareness of duty, an idea of self, and the concept of service. It created honorable, upstanding citizens. Hey, there is no freedom without its coordinate responsibility. An administrator at National Cathedral School recently asserted, "We don't teach objective truth." That's tantamount to a denial of it, because to not teach it at a school that purposes to, quote, educate young women to embrace our core values of excellence, service, courage, and conscience. Well, if there is no objective truth, there are no core values. That's a contradiction in terms. If everything is relative, then what can possibly be seen to excel or be seen as excellence? What is service? Is it just self-service? So while education used to be the search for truth, beauty, and goodness, which would lead to virtue, now education in the U.S. seems to focus on its opposite, teaching the absence of those things. Relativism. When I was pregnant with my first child, I was determined to have the baby naturally. I wanted no drugs. I figured, I'm tough. I can handle this. I know. I had a whole birthing plan. I was naively optimistic, and I lacked enough education to really understand all the parameters in the overall scheme of things, which is odd because I had done a lot of reading and research. And the big day came when my water broke 2 weeks early. I wasn't quite prepared for that. We headed to the hospital. Have you ever noticed that much of our medical procedures and advice is fear-based? Granted, insurance companies dictate a good proportion of procedures, and those dictates are also fear-based. The fear of lawsuits. The small snag we hit was that although my water broke, I had not gone into labor. No contractions yet. And that carried with it some small risk. If the baby was not delivered before, an infection might enter the womb. So procedure prescribed, I be put on induction medications, which they did immediately. I remember the nurse saying, "This should get you ready to deliver right on time at about 7 when the doctor will be here." They had a plan, and their plan didn't take into account my plan. So for the entire night, I labored in excruciating agony, worse than natural labor, by the way. And I refusing any painkillers because my plan was for no drugs. It never occurred to my pregnancy brain that Pitocin, the labor-inducing medication, was a drug. And the funniest part is that it didn't really work anyway, despite all the night-long torture the next morning, because there was absolutely no progress. The doctor ordered an epidural for me in preparation for a cesarean section. That took hold in less than an hour, and I pushed out a healthy baby boy with 3 tries. So much for my plan, though. In hindsight, I could have waited to go to the hospital for several days until my body naturally went into labor, but I was working in a fear paradigm, as were the hospital staff and the insurance dictums, and under time constraints as well. In the education of our children, though, the time considerations are much less pronounced. We aren't dealing in minutes, hours, days, or even weeks, but in years and with lifetimes. And we shouldn't be making decisions based on our fears, but on our aspirations for these precious little ones. And maybe, most importantly, we've got to scrap the initial plan because the parameters have all drastically changed. So, what's the takeaway? We don't think about education the way we should. We have a fear response programmed by a system that seeks not to educate in the traditional sense of the word, but does the exact opposite and instills an unhealthy reverence for money instead of character. A system that declares its highest aspiration to be college prep and career readiness, but even fails at that. This show, School's Out with Sam Sorbo, is here to challenge that approach. It's time to reevaluate an antiquated system and revamp the entire way we think about education. No more letting bureaucrats determine who instructs your children and what they learn. I'm here to empower parents to decide what's important and become the heroes their children need them to be. In the next episode, we will tackle our biggest obstacle, fear, and we will conquer it. Thank you for watching. This is School's Out with Sam Sorbo. See you next time.